Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, stay with us as the Suns get set to shine.
Here's Perry, to Hurd. Here's the jump shot.
Comes to Marley, a long three. He got it! He got it! Into Booker. Here's the three. Suzanne! Another Sir Charles, and he flies in for a wham, bam, slam. Whammo time! He got it! Suzanne! Oh, brother!
Welcome to a very special trade reaction episode of the 7 Seconds or Less podcast. My name is Max McCauley, and I'm joined by David Nash. David, we had a crazy trade last night. McDonough and Morey stunned kind of everybody, I think, by pulling off a trade where the Suns sent Marquese and Brandon Knight to Houston for Ryan Anderson and De'Anthony Melton. David, what were your initial thoughts on this?
I was shocked, Max. I think, like everyone, I did the refresh on Twitter a few times. Double-checked that it wasn't a fake Wodge account I was getting busted by, and then kind of sat there for a few minutes, trying to decompress and work out what it all meant. And that's why we're jumping on this pod, I suppose. We've had a little bit of time to look at it now, and McNinja strikes again, Max.
Yeah, I like just like you, I checked that Woj tweet at least 3 or 4 times. I thought it was fake for sure. I couldn't believe it. It didn't seem to make any sense at first, and that was my initial reaction to it. Was just like, why would either team do this, really? I mean, I'm a huge Melton fan, so we'll get into this later. I like it, but I'm just stunned that either team did this. Yeah,
it just seems like one of those trades where, as you said, it didn't make a lot of sense right in the first instant, but hopefully we can break it down for the listeners that have tuned into this and make some sense of it for Suns fans, and not going to worry too much about the Rockets side or why they're doing this, but I think there's some clear wins there for the Suns, and then some clear questions going forward as well, Max.
Yeah, so do you want to start with the wins, maybe? Maybe go over what you think is like the better parts of this trade.
Well, I don't know if this is a hot take or not, Max, but, you and I have discussed Brandon Knight quite a bit, and I was never, feeling that great about him going into the season as the starting point guard. But, I'll just say off the bat, I think if you're comparing Ryan Anderson to Brandon Knight as far as what they're going to do next year to help this team, I'm taking Ryan Anderson every day of the week.
Yeah, the thing about Ryan Anderson, he's gotten much maligned because of his defense, particularly against the better teams and in the playoffs. But the Suns don't really need him in the playoffs yet, right? We're not going to be in the playoffs, so just to have someone who can space the floor at power forward with Ayton out there, help Booker have space, that's huge.
Exactly, and I just keep looking back and thinking back to when I cut all that film for the TJ Warren article that I wrote, which is right. Now probably dead in the water, but that's fine. I think I learned a lot, and I can think of a lot of times where I was watching video where Igor was continually talking about a lifting 4, and I was placing Ariza in there and trying to work with the pieces that we had at the time. Someone like TJ at small forward to work out how it was all going to work out. But now you've got Anderson in that kind of Channing Frye lifting 4 example that Igor quite often uses. And now I guess Ariza slides over to the 3, and you've got 2 legitimate shooters now, rather than having to play those funky lineups and come up with the funky ways that I was trying to come up with to make it all work in a starting 5. So it's pretty exciting from that point of view. There's obviously the defensive issues, as you mentioned, but as far as getting wins for this Suns offseason, they continue to add shooting, which was a major negative for this team last season, and something that Booker struggled with, not having around him, and they're building a bit of a squad, Max.
Yeah, it should be a prettier team to watch, I think, out there, because Brandon Knight, I mean, we had hoped that he'd get better, but historically he's not been the most fun guy to watch, right? Not the most pleasant guy to watch. Very selfish player, took a lot of long twos. And then, like you said, having Ryan Anderson out there is just going to make the whole offense run better, so I think it's going to make the team a little more fun to watch. It is kind of annoying that we spent so much time talking about who's going to start at small forward and Ariza at the 4 when none of that stuff's going to happen anymore. But let's turn to Melton. I don't think you've seen as much of Melton as I have, but what were your initial reactions to the Suns acquiring Melton?
I was going to throw this one to you because, as you said, we both had Melton on our radar pre-draft, and I listed him in that group of really perfect Booker partners. Not the top of the group, but he was certainly in there. But you were definitely higher on him than I was, Max. So why don't you break it down for the listeners? Is he the prize of this trade? Do you think?
In my view, he is. He was, I think I had him, I can't remember exactly where I had him on my big board before the draft, but it was like 11 or 12 or 13, something like that. The thing about him is, like, it's not just projection with him. I think some people sometimes project tall, strong, lengthy guards to be good defenders just based on their physical attributes. But Melton, that guy's already an insanely good defender. His instincts are off the charts. Like, he has those instincts where he can just jump passing lanes like we wouldn't expect it, and where he just can just like kind of predict where people are going to go when he's guarding them. He has those talents you can't really teach on defense, which is so huge, particularly for point guard defense. The thing on him, the rub's always been the offense, right? The shooting. Although the offense, like the playmaking is actually pretty good. It's really more the shooting. He could not shoot at all, especially when you were at USC. Obviously, he was suspended last year for his sophomore year at USC for reasons that were incredibly dumb. But at Summer League, he looked a lot better with the shot. I've heard he's better in workouts and stuff. So, although I think Evan Sider, our friend, told us he airballed a couple of threes at the Suns workout. So apparently that wasn't enough to dissuade them.
Yeah, one of those guys that I think has been in the gym with Drew Hanlon, if I remember correctly. And yeah, he did show out at Summer League. I think he still shot sub 40% overall from the field, but 16 points per game, 7 rebounds, 4 assists, and 3 steals. So, he's the kind of guy that you and I, coming up later in this podcast, actually, talked about a lot in terms of the type of guys that suit well next to Devin Booker. And, it's funny, Max, you mentioned you had Melton quite high on your board. So I can't remember where you had Okobo, but, with Bridges and Ayton, I imagine the Suns now have, 4 guys that you maybe had inside the top 20 on your pre-draft board.
Yeah, I think I had Okobo around 20. Melton and Bridges like maybe 2 or 3 spots apart, maybe 4 spots. So like I viewed Melton as being almost as good of a prospect as Mikal Bridges. So that's why I'm so high on this trade, really, overall.
Yeah, and we should mention, Max, that he's actually unsigned right now. So as far as the logistics of this trade go, the Suns have essentially traded for his rights. There's no contract there at the moment. The Suns will have to work something out there with Melton, and there's Jeff Siegel, I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right, is a great follow on Twitter for Cap stuff, and he's noted that there's a certain way that the Suns can do this to make sure that they get one of those team-friendly 3 or 4 year contracts with Melton and hopefully lock him up as a long-term piece as part of this young core, which is getting bigger and getting younger, Max.
It really is. So you think they're more likely to go the Okobo-ish route of giving him sort of like a quasi first round deal, or do you think they're more likely to give him a traditional second rounder deal, or even a 2-way?
Yeah, it's interesting. I floated the 2-way last night on Twitter and got some pushback on that, just because there's a lot of people on draft Twitter and NBA Twitter that are quite high on Melton, and they push back thinking the team would be better placed to get that 3 or 4 year locked in deal, which I was kind of saying to that that can be the end goal here, but as we've noted plenty of times, the Suns are in a little bit of a roster gymnastics situation just at this moment. So I wouldn't be totally surprised if they give Melton that kind of wink Mike James 2-way deal. But I think if they can get off Arthur or make another 2-for-1 type deal that frees up a roster spot, Melton should probably get locked into a longer term deal, because there's a lot of smart people that are quite high on him. And I think maybe that season that he did miss in college, as you mentioned, is one reason that he slid so far, because I remember around draft time, people were very surprised that he fell just that far in the draft. And there's a lot of people, I guess, overnight that have praised the trade from the Suns' point of view to pick him up off the Rockets.
Yeah, I think you made an important point there that there's sort of a draft Twitter NBA people divide here, I think, because Melton, what was it, the 46th pick or something like that Houston got him with? Yeah. The Suns even passed on him with number 31 overall, so everyone's saying that it would be crazy to sign him to a 2-way. I think is looking at this from not a league perspective, but like a draft Twitter perspective.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to get into is you kind of brought up another trade being possible, and I think it's worth noting that Woj kind of implied that the Suns are going to try to trade for a starting caliber point guard. So maybe Suns fans shouldn't get too attached to Melton, because it wouldn't be the most surprising thing in the world if his rights were in a trade like that.
Yeah, it wouldn't be surprising if his were, or one of the other Suns young guys that we're talking about here is, yeah, I think we've touched on a couple of pods in this series where, we've talked about, there's only so many guys you can attach yourself to, because if you want to get better, and this team's been quite bad, those guys are going to get thrown in trades every now and then. So, when I saw this trade, I really just kind of thought to myself, Booker and Ayton are probably the untouchables right now, and everything else builds around that. And I wouldn't be surprised to see even a Josh Jackson, a Mikal Bridges, anyone get thrown in the right deal, because when you have that much young top end talent, it's about making the right deal at the right time. I wouldn't advocate for a deal like that. I'm very impressed actually with the front office in the fact that they are building a more competitive team for next year without actually throwing away too much of their kind of future assets. I guess it depends where you sit on a guy like Marquese Chriss, but we only just recently discussed on the Power Forward pod that I was really only ever projecting his ceiling to be a kind of bench backup 5 guy going forward. So, and that's another note here with McDonough. He made that big trade for Marquese Chriss, and he's walking away from that now, and he's copping a little bit of heat for that, I've seen online, but I kind of think it shows a bit of maturity in him as a GM. He's kind of recognized his mistakes and isn't afraid to move on from both he and Brandon Knight, who probably go down as his 2 worst deals as the Suns GM, Max. So this move and any that come after will probably define whether McDonough keeps going down in one direction, or, maybe those deals are forgotten long-term because of some of these newer ones that he's made.
I could not agree with you more. It's so important to have a GM who understands the sunk cost fallacy. Like, what? Yeah, you paid a lot for Brandon Knight, you paid a lot for Marquese Chriss, but if you just hang on to him for that reason, you're just hurting yourself even more, right? You're just throwing good money after bad money. So
exactly,
very glad that McDonough's willing to move on from his mistakes like that. Although I will know it's a little annoying. So some people have reacted to this by saying, "Oh, Marquese Chriss gonna go to Houston, be a steal, gonna be awesome." Like, you people were saying that Marquese Chriss can't even be in the league. He's gonna go to the Guangdong Tigers, and now he's gonna be awesome all of a sudden because he's not in the Suns anymore. It's a little bit annoying.
It is a little annoying. I'm not going to lie. It is always a little bit apprehensive sending a guy like that, and even Brandon Knight, to a smart team like Houston. But I think it was time for both of those guys to move on. And this trade, time will tell. But how Anderson performs next year, and how Knight performs too. We haven't touched on him too much, and there's a lot of this podcast that's going to go after our reaction here that ended up getting dumped, where you and I talked quite extensively on Brandon Knight. But whether he's even healthy is going to be a big major factor in how this trade is maybe viewed in 12 months time, and maybe the Suns, for just a little bit more extra salary this year and next, are getting a more viable player in their starting 5. You noted Woj tweeted about the point guard situation. He also tweeted that Ryan Anderson will be the starting 4 for the Suns. So Woj is tweeting lineup announcements now, it seems, and we get all of our news from him.
Yeah, he's got a nice connection with McDonough, huh? They're having a long chat about how the team's going to look.
Yeah.
Speaking of Woj's Nuggets, one of the things in his article was that the Suns just love Shaq and want to get him more time.
Mm-hmm.
I guess kind of a 2-part question. Do you think that this trade, first of all, is indication that the Suns thought Shaq is just better than Brandon Knight? And then second of all, do you think Shaq's pinned to be the starter?
I guess right now you would have to say Shaq is the starter, but we can't ignore what Woj tweeted, and I definitely don't think we can ignore that the next move before the start of the season, or hopefully even before camp, might be a starting caliber point guard. But I'll tease again that the pod coming up after this, we delve into Okobo and Shaq quite a bit in terms of how they might project forward as starters next to someone like Devin Booker. But to answer your question, Max, we kind of said this at the top. I think it just has more to do with the fact that the Suns, as I said, even at a little bit more cost, are a little bit more comfortable that Ryan Anderson's going to be a positive piece for them going forward than what Brandon Knight was going to be. And, right now, who are we to doubt that? They have all the intel on Brandon Knight, and, time will tell, as I said, with how he performs on the Rockets. So, I'm still rooting for him to get back and being a capable NBA player, but, we've touched on it quite a lot. I wasn't very excited about it being as the Suns' starting point guard this year, and I'm not going to lie. I'm excited by a move by this because of what else it might mean.
Yeah, to me, I agree with you. It screams that they just didn't view the Knight to Shaq as much of a drop-off, if any drop-off, and they also thought that neither Chris nor Bender was going to be able to start at the 4. And I guess they didn't want to start at Ariza at the 4. It seemed like they desperately wanted a starting caliber power forward, which I think so. That's the interesting thing, right? Because most people on Twitter, at least Suns Twitter, in our circles, were more talking about Melton last night. But I think from the Suns' perspective, this deal is actually a lot more about acquiring Ryan Anderson.
Yeah, as I said, I've kind of spent the last few hours. This is all happening in a 24-hour day period for me in Australia. I haven't slept yet, so I've been thinking about this from Anderson's perspective quite a bit, and how much he might be able to help this team. A lot of the jokes were made about his defense and things like that, but he's still a career 38% shooter from 3, and he's going to space the floor. And one thing that I did think of, Max, is kind of it's funny how we as fans and people who follow the team quite closely try and draw the links, and the Suns said that they needed a starting power forward, and then they went out and signed Trevor Ariza, so we automatically kind of made this story of how Ariza's going to be the starting power forward, and now this trade's made and we're kind of sliding Ariza down to the 3, and now there's a logjam of Mikal Bridges, Josh Jackson and TJ Warren, and then everyone then kind of moves on to, all right, we've got to move TJ Warren to get that starting point guard. So this is all part of the fun of being an NBA fan, and particular a Suns fan. But yeah, I think Anderson is an interesting one. I noted it late last night on Twitter. We're kind of looking at Houston 2.0 here. You and I have spent quite a bit of time, and the recent pod with Josh was one example where we spoke about Booker as a Harden-type player, and now the Suns have both Ariza and Anderson probably in a starting lineup with Booker. Beverly's a guy that we've spoken about quite a bit as maybe a starting point guard next to Booker. So, they're kind of looking at that Houston blueprint maybe here, Max.
Yeah, I think they absolutely are. One thing about Ryan Anderson, his pure three-point percentages might not tell you this. If you haven't watched a lot of Houston, is he doesn't just space the floor to the three-point line. That guy routinely shoots three-pointers from like 3 feet behind the three-point line. He's a knockdown shooter. He might be one of the best. He definitely is one of the best power forward shooters in the NBA. So if you're trying to space the floor with Booker and Ayton, I think you found almost a perfect power forward to do that. Defensive questions aside. And yeah, so Ryan Anderson will shore up the starting power forward. And David, it seems like that we finally have the answer to the question. I tweeted this last night. We never have to talk about this anymore, but Bender versus Chris, at least the Suns have answered the question.
Yeah, and I would say that the other question around Bender's option is probably answered here too. I would be very surprised to see the Suns both trade away Marquese Chris and decline Bender's option. So another thing that we've discussed recently, Max, which we should get some clarity on, probably not for a little while given when the deadline is, but yeah, I think we can expect Bender to be around long term and maybe be the next Ryan Anderson, because he's not going to be around forever, and the Suns are building those kind of understudies under this veteran-laced team now around Booker and Ayton. But Max, how about we end with a little short edition of 7 seconds or less? I'm going to make it a very strict 7 seconds for you here, and we're not allowed to go over as we normally do. I'm pulling on the 7 seconds or less questions that we actually had tied into this episode originally, and I've mixed them up a little with this trade. So are you game?
I'm absolutely game. I have to follow the rules for once, so I'm nervous.
All right, Max. So the first question, and I will credit Chris Hansen with this because we didn't credit him when we went over the questions the first time, because we actually forgot he was the one that came up with the question.
Sorry, Chris.
But Nash as point guard in this team now with Anderson in that Channing Frye type role. How many extra wins would you place for the Suns this upcoming season?
Oh my God, the spacing. That offense would be awesome. They'd be in the mid-40s, I think, at least.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you there, and bonus points for sticking to the time there. So straight into the second question, Max. The original question here that you threw me was any point guard from any era to add to this team with Booker, but I'll change that slightly, and you're not allowed to have Steph Curry like you said last time. You can take one point guard for this team currently that's currently in the league right now. Who do you take?
I can't take Steph Curry, you said?
You cannot.
Oh, I only have 7 seconds and I'm blinking. Let's bring on Chris Paul. He works with Harden. That'd be some nice defense.
Just keep that Houston 2.0 going, eh?
Right. And you said just currently, right? So I don't think about going forward just this season.
Yeah.
It's Chris Paul, just to be clear.
All right, Max, question number 3. Last time it was around Knight, Okobo, and Shaq and the All-Star game, which the listeners will hear a little later. But I'm going to mix it up with this one. Going forward, who do you have the most confidence will be a starting caliber point guard next to Devin Booker? De'Anthony Melton, Shaquille Harrison, or Ali Okobo?
It's definitely De'Anthony Melton for me. As I said, I had him ranked very highly in this very good draft class. I think he's a special defender. If all he has to do is add the shot, and he's going to be really, really good.
I am not surprised by that answer at all.
Yeah, I didn't think you would be. So, as you've been mentioning, we recorded a podcast on the point guard position. This news obviously kind of threw everything into flux, so we had to record a little something on the trade beforehand, but we're now going to transition you into what our podcast was last week. As David mentioned, we cut out the Brandon Knight part because it's no longer relevant, but we kept the discussion of Shaquille Harrison and Eli Okobo because they're obviously still on the team. We also dive into the 2019 free agency and draft classes for the point guards, so that should also be relevant. David, anything else we need to disclaim before we move on?
No, that's pretty much it, Max, and I'm glad we can keep a lot of that stuff. It's probably the first time since starting this podcast we've had to deal with a time-sensitive thing like this. But as I said, I'm glad that the listeners can still enjoy a lot of the discussion that we did have in that recording because some of it is probably even more relevant now after this trade, Max.
Yeah, that's a good point. They're definitely looking for something long-term now.
Enjoy, guys.
We're going to be talking about the point guard position today, and specifically we're going to ask the question, can the Suns get adequate point guard play this season? It's been much debated on Twitter. It's been much debated between David and myself. And after that, if we're going to decide that they can't get it or that they just can't get good enough play, we're going to talk about what they might be able to add this season and also what they might be able to add going forward. I think there's just really two other major options here, and it's Shaq Harrison, who was awesome in Summer League and great at the end of last year, and who it sounds like has really impressed the team. And then Eli Okobo, who they took number 31 overall, but gave him a 4-year guaranteed contract, treated him basically as a first-round pick. So let's start with Shaq. What do you think about him? Do you think he could become the starter?
It's a good question, and something that we should probably throw back to what we just ended on with Brandon Knight there. I don't see Shaq projecting as a starter this season. Maybe more longer term. You know, I've got some kind of points here in terms of he could maybe turn into a Patrick Beverley type in the longer term. But if we're talking purely about the 18-19 season, I would throw Shaq in that same conversation. He may not start games, but I could certainly see situations where Shaq's defense in particular is needed to close games, to shut the opposition point guard down. And I think, Max, is it a stretch to say that we might see Shaq finish more games at point guard than maybe he starts?
That's really interesting. If the answer is more than he starts, I think that's probably going to be the way it goes. I don't think he's ever going to start, but it's possible. But like you said, I think that especially if the other team has a really good perimeter player, like say we're playing against the Houston Rockets, and for once in our goddamn team's lives, we're actually in the game. Although I guess we were in the game with Josh Jackson, that crazy game. But anyway. So just say we're in that situation, and Chris Paul is cooking. He's playing awesomely. I could totally see them being like, hell, we need Shaq out there. There's no other way we're gonna be able to guard these guys because Shaq is. It's not just Suns fans' homerism. Shaq Harrison's defense has gotten a lot of notoriety around the league. I think Cole Zwicker, a friend of the podcast, Nate Duncan, not a friend of the podcast, but still like him. They both pointed out how awesome he was in Summer League and how much fun it was to watch the guy play defense. And that's an incredibly valuable skill, especially next to someone like Devin Booker, who as everyone knows, a bit of a questionable defender.
Yeah, and I think we've noted it a couple of times on our pod before. We particularly with young guys, I think we spoke about it with Bender last, is it's all about having an NBA-ready skill and getting yourself on the floor and then allowing, certain other aspects of your game to develop around that. And that's the thing with Shaq. His defense is ready to play on an NBA floor kind of right away. And, not to bring up bad memories of the Earl Watson era, but, we saw this with someone like Derrick Jones Jr., who Earl Watson kind of threw out to guard, Russell Westbrook in certain scenarios. And, I think that's what we might see with Shaq. He might be kind of a platoon guy 10, 15 minutes a night that you throw out there. Maybe some other nights he won't play at all, but he'll kind of be out there to pester guys and get the likes of Russell Westbrook into like a one-on-one matchup that they're really worried about and that they want to try and, overtake this guy that they've never heard of. And he can kind of get teams out of their rhythm. I think that's the role we're going to see Shaq in. And then it's about whether he can, develop some of those things around the game. So his playmaking as a point guard and, particularly his off-ball shooting. As we noted, Booker's going to be taking a lot of the ball in these situations. And for Shaq to be valuable on the court on offense, he's probably going to have to at least be able to hit, a wide-open corner three. But the signs in Summer League were promising, Max. What did you kind of take away outside of his defense from his Summer League play?
Yeah, it's interesting because I thought his playmaking was pretty bad. It was okay, but, he was on the court a lot with Ayton, and, we can't say that Ayton suffered from bad point guard play without pointing out who the point guard was, right? But, he wasn't terrible. I think he averaged a few assists a game. He made sort of the easy passes. He doesn't really create much. He just kind of takes what's there. In terms of shooting, I was pretty encouraged. I thought the ball looked better out of his hands than it did last season. I also heard, I think this is also on the Dunked On podcast, that he supposedly killed it at a camp after shooting the ball, after Summer League. Apparently it was just awesome. If he can add a reliable three-point shooter in space of four, it's going to go a long way towards making him really valuable because a 3-and-D guard is kind of exactly what you want with Devin Booker, particularly if Devin Booker takes another playmaking step. I mean, say that Shaq adds a 38% three-point shot, and Devin Booker, is up to 6.5, 7 assists a game, low turnover ratio. I mean, then you kind of want them closing games together, right?
Yeah, exactly. And as you know, I watched kind of every pick and roll possession from Summer League again 2 or 3 times, and I think those early entry passes to Ayton maybe blind us a little bit on the point guard play, particularly of Shaq Harrison. I think he actually ended up averaging like 6.6 assists over the whole tournament, which is, pretty impressive.
Oh, wow.
and by far the most assists on that Suns team. And, particularly in the pick and roll, he made some pretty clever passes. And he kind of got to the rim at ease as well, which, as I noted with Ayton, he was a big reason for that. The gravity that he possesses allowed guys like Shaq to attack the rim. And, as you said, he shot it pretty well. I think he was 45% overall at Summer League, and pretty small sample size here, but he was 4 of 9 from 3 as well, which you can only hit the shots you're asked to take, and the signs are at least a little bit encouraging there from Summer League, and hopefully something for him to build on, because as I said before, and a guy we might touch on very much later in this pod is Patrick Beverley, and I think the comp's certainly there. Shaq's a little taller than Beverley, but Beverley has that ridiculous 6'7" wingspan and is quite a capable NBA defender, and he was kind of the first major partner for James Harden on the Rockets. They eventually moved away from him because they needed a little bit more playmaking, but he's as you mentioned, the kind of archetype if Booker is that kind of guy that you're looking to go with. Shaq certainly got the game to build on to become that guy next to him.
I love that comp. That's a really nice one. I'm not sure Shaq has quite the nastiness, although he gets into people, because Beverly, he's the nastiest player in the league.
Yes, and that's what I love about him.
No, yeah, absolutely. That's why I'd love to have him next to Booker, because we could use a little bit of that there. But that's a really nice comp, though. I think that Suns fans who want to know what the upside of Shaq Harrison is, I think that's a great person to point to is Patrick Beverley. And as you pointed out, he was awesome next to Harden. And I don't think they would have traded. So here's the thing. Of course, they're going to trade him for Chris Paul. Chris Paul is awesome. He's one of the best 10 players in the league.
Exactly.
But I don't think they would have traded Beverley for somebody of Chris Paul's skill set who was around Beverley's value, right? Because that's kind of what you want next to Harden is Beverley, unless you have a superstar.
Yeah, you don't miss a lot of Beverley's things with Chris Paul coming in, obviously, because he does a lot of other things a lot better. And Chris Paul's an amazing defender at his height already on his own. So yeah, I think obviously the Rockets were never going to not do that trade. But yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't know how many other point guards there were in the league that was going to tempt Daryl Morey into making that decision, because I think they were pretty happy with Patrick Beverley as the Harden partner, and that's the kind of guy we should be looking to place with Booker, I think. But should we move on to Okobo, Max?
Yeah, let's move on to Okobo, who it's going to be probably the more difficult of these three guys to talk about, just because we've seen him less. His summer league was interesting. His first game was awesome and very exciting. He showed, I'd say, displays of passing acumen that I don't think maybe either Knight or Harrison have.
Yep.
He also, he can score. I mean, the guy went off for, 42, 43 points in the fringe playoffs?
Yep.
So there's definitely more upside, I would say, I think, to Okobo than to the other guys. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely more upside there, but he had a significantly worse summer league. He is a rookie and did cop an injury as well, which was really disappointing. It kind of saw him miss all of that game that had happened in, and then a whole nother extra game that they could have maybe thrown him out there. But I think Shaq clearly was the priority there because of his contract situation, and Okobo might just take a little longer to evaluate. But yeah, I think it's a good point. I don't think we'll see him kind of starting or anything this year. Kind of as we noted with Bridges, there's probably enough young guys going to be in the starting lineup already, so these guys are going to have to earn their minutes in the second unit. But I was probably most encouraged because my big negatives on Okobo kind of scouting him pre-draft were that he was a little bit of a chucker and maybe a little erratic. It was very clear, and there was even some quotes out of Summer League that Okobo's main priority was really executing what Igor wanted to run. And that was kind of what I was most impressed with, because you definitely saw it out on the court. It didn't come across in his stats. His stats were actually quite poor at the end of the day. But the eye test stuff, which is why that's also still important, was definitely there with Okobo. What do you think?
Yeah, he didn't shoot well, but whatever. It's a very small sample size. I don't really care if someone doesn't shoot well in Summer League.
Yeah, exactly.
But like you said, I totally agree with you. I love seeing... So I think... We were all kind of worried he was going to come in and just be the chucker guy. I think that was the big... Because that's kind of his reputation from Europe. But I think I totally agree with you, and I'm not surprised. I didn't hear those comments, but I'm not surprised that he said that, because that's exactly what I saw from him, particularly in Game 1. He was very interested in getting everyone else involved. And I actually thought maybe the stats don't back this up. Maybe your couple rewatches don't back this up. But it seemed to me that Ayton played the best when he had Okobo with him on the floor. That's just sort of an anecdotal thing, but that's kind of what I saw.
It was definitely a better two-man game, I think, with those guys, for sure. And as you said, we didn't get to see it a hell of a lot, which was disappointing. We may get to see it a little bit more in the season proper, because I think Igor will definitely throw the lineups around a little bit and maybe even play Ayton with the second unit a little bit if he's struggling on a particular night with the starters. So, I think that's an interesting point. But I'll throw this to you, Max. We've kind of touched on it a little bit already, but in terms of style, they both got that kind of size. They both are, I'd say, around 6'3", with the kind of 6'7", 6'8" wingspan. But, we've noted kind of different games, at least of what we know of them right now. So, at their absolute ceilings for both of them, which one do you actually think is the better partner for Booker in a long-term backcourt?
That's really interesting. I hate to make a cop-out here, but it really just depends so much on the development of both. Particularly Shaq's three-point shooting is just so huge. I don't think... If Shaq is never going to be a real shooter, he's going to shoot around 30% or whatever from three for his whole career. For me, I don't think you can have a guy like that around Booker. If I'm trying to optimize Booker, who is, let's be honest, he's going to, even if he improves on defense, Booker's an offensive player. You're going to want to have people around him who can shoot the hell out of the ball, because that's how you space the floor. That's how you make him as good as he could possibly be. Devin Booker will never be LeBron, and he may never be Harden, but he's still someone who you're going to optimize by having shooters around him who can space the floor. And if Shaq can't do that, then I don't think he's a long-term guy. He's more of a backup. Okobo, we're not even sure if Okobo can play in the NBA yet. I think we're more sure that Shaq can, right? Okobo's just so tough. He's almost as much of a mystery box as anybody, because he's a European guard who we haven't seen play against NBA talent very much, besides a few summer league games. So maybe if you're asking me for their absolute peak, I'd probably just go with Okobo just because of his age. Like maybe Okobo just blows up on both ends of the floor, because as you said, similar profile. Maybe he plays defense. He hasn't really yet, from what I've heard in Europe, but maybe he does in the NBA. So I guess the answer is Okobo, but it's a tough one. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with you there and lean Okobo kind of longer term. Yeah, I think he's got less in his game that he needs to make up for to be a good partner with Booker. And, one thing I'll note with the Beverly comp is, as much as I like it with Shaq Harrison, I think Beverly was quite a good shooter from 3 in college. And, Harrison's therefore kind of really starting behind the 8 ball from that standpoint, and the playmaking stuff is probably more in comparison to Beverly out when he came out of college. With Okobo, can he be the defender? We've noted he's got the size, so maybe it is more just an application thing. And as we saw in France, he was very much a kind of primary option. So can he round those things out in his game when he's next to someone like Booker and become more dominant in other aspects of his game? So that'll be an interesting thing for Suns fans to watch going forward between those two. But whilst I'm a little panicky about this season itself, there's definitely some options there going forward at point guard for the Suns, and it's nice to have some projects building underneath Max.
So let's go ahead and get into the 2019 free agency point guard class, because I think you and I both agree that while it's possible they can get some adequate point guard play this season, it's probably a very big long shot they have their starting point guard on the roster. Maybe Okobo, but we both agree it's probably not going to come from this roster right now.
Yeah, definitely. They need to be looking elsewhere longer term, Max.
Fortunately for them, the 2019 free agency point guard class is stacked. I'm just going to read it off to you, okay?
Go for it.
Kyrie Irving, Kemba Walker, Eric Bledsoe, Ricky Rubio, Goran Dragic, player option, Jeff Teague, player option, Spencer Dinwiddie, D'Angelo Russell is a restricted free agent. Tyus Jones, restricted. DeLon Wright, restricted. Terry Rozier, restricted. Malcolm Brogdon, restricted. Patrick Beverley's free. George Hill has like a $2 million guarantee. Probably, I think that they're going to cut him. Jeremy Lin, Darren Collison, Corey Joseph, and your favorite player, Milos Teodosic. So not all those names are guys we target, right? Like, so the Suns are not going to go after Eric Bledsoe, obviously. The Suns are not going to probably sign Kyrie Irving. We can say it's a long shot possibility, but it's probably not going to happen. But names like that push down, they'll get signed by somebody, and thus the other names will be available. It's an incredibly deep crop of free agents that just wasn't, they weren't possibilities this summer.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of looking at that list, I put them into kind of 3 main groups, I think, Max.
Okay.
And the top group would be guys like Kyrie, Kemba, maybe even Jeff Teague if he opts out, who I think is kind of universally underrated as a point guard.
Interesting.
And then,
so wait, let's go into that. Real quick, let's stop on Jeff Teague. So I think Jeff Teague's a good player, but do you think he's a good fit with Devin Booker?
I think he's a pretty, decent pass-first point guard who's, rather unselfish and has, in a couple of different teams and a couple of different franchises, kind of sacrificed his role a little bit to the better of the team. So from that standpoint, I see him as quite a good fit. I don't think he's a perfect fit. And I don't know whether you would kind of throw the book at him, so to speak. But yeah, I think there's enough there to suggest if the Suns really were looking to get better and he was the one that was willing to come to Phoenix, I don't think I would say no to it. What about you?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I don't think it's perfect. He's like an okay defender, I guess, like kind of like, a little below average-ish. And he's like kind of the same shooter. He's like maybe an average-ish shooter. So he's not perfect. But as you said, he's a pass-first kind of guy, team player. It's okay. It's not something that you're excited about, but it's fine.
Yeah, so then the second group for me, Max, is probably a few guys that bring maybe different things that you would maybe target, and that's someone we discussed before in Patrick Beverley. I think, he brings a different style of point guard, so you might go after someone like him. Another guy is a completely different style who Igor is obviously familiar with is a guy in Ricky Rubio. I've got Goran Dragic on this list just in terms of being a different style point guard. Not that the Suns may go there, but he's...
Well, he also has that connection with Igor too.
Yeah, so he definitely sits in that group. And then as much as I don't really want the Suns to look at restricted free agents, I've got Terry Rozier on this list just because I think his upside and what he might do this year on the back of his playoffs last year is worth kind of looking at and keeping an eye on. So that's kind of my second tier, Max, in terms of probably still need to upgrade the position if the Suns really want to make a playoff push, for instance, in 1920.
So what about... Here's a couple of guys that I think are interesting. Tyus Jones, first of all. I know you said you don't like restricted free agents, but what do you think about Tyus?
He was a guy that I kind of wanted the Suns to go after this offseason with kind of what the Wolves were doing and it looking like he may be available in terms of, them bringing Derrick Rose back again and him maybe being shunted to that third point guard role again in Minnesota. So, yeah, I think he definitely fits that second group mold of, you just deciding that you want to either get younger or go in a slightly different direction.
And then here's one that's controversial. It's one of those upside, downside things. And also, it's going to depend a lot on what we see from him this year because, there's a big question marks with this guy. But what do you think about D'Angelo Russell?
D'Angelo is a funny one. He's kind of... I've got this list here, Max. A question I'll throw at you now, actually, is kind of... Who would be your least favourite for the Suns to kind of go all in on next offseason out of Bledsoe, Goran Dragic, and D'Angelo Russell?
Very, very, very easily Eric Bledsoe. Not hard.
all have links back to the Suns or obviously Devin Booker in Russell's case. But, I think they're kind of three danger names that, for me, next offseason, if the Suns really honed in on one of those guys as their, the target, I'd be a little bit apprehensive, I think.
I wouldn't worry yourself too much about them going after Eric Bledsoe. I don't think either party is going to be interested in that one. But D'Angelo Russell's interesting, though, because I want to see what he looks like this year, because theoretically there's a lot to like about a Booker-D'Angelo Russell pairing. D'Angelo Russell's maybe not, he hasn't really shown it yet, but he's going to be a good shooter, I think. He definitely has the mechanics, and he has sort of the pull-up game that you want to see out of a kind of a lead-initiating shooter. He's got great vision. He doesn't put it together consistently, but I think he had a 35% assist rate or something like that this year. That dude could pass. The defense is really the question mark, right? But he's big. Him and Devin Booker are both bigger guards. And I think that theoretically you could kind of get away with having those guys play together if they just make incremental improvements defensively. And I don't know if you listened to this yet. If you haven't, you should, and every listener should. But Vecini and Cole Zwicker had a podcast recently where they broke down the top 25 young players, I think under 23 players. And Sam Vecini actually had D'Angelo Russell very high. I think he was 21 or 22 in the whole league. And he just still believes in a lot of those traits that made him the number 2 overall pick. And one of the things he mentioned was that D'Angelo Russell, while his foot speed is not great, he actually is sort of like a smart defender. And there's some world, I think, where Booker and Russell could develop into a pretty interesting backcourt.
Yeah, I think that's it's a modern backcourt in terms of, both players being able to shoot the lights out from deep, both play make a little whilst not being kind of primary guys themselves. Mm-hmm. And probably fits very well with what we've spoken a lot in terms of kind of Igor's system and what he's run in the past with that Slovenian team and, kind of even what Utah have done this most recent season with the ball being in Donovan Mitchell's hands a lot and Ricky Rubio playing that kind of secondary role. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I think you make a good point that he's kind of maybe becoming undervalued in the league and certainly looks to already be on the outside looking in maybe in Brooklyn. So, yeah, I think he's probably the kind of free agent that no one else is really targeting when it comes to July 1 next year, and maybe the Suns can swoop in and get a decent deal there. So I definitely wouldn't rule that one out, Max.
Yeah, it helps that he's buddies with Devin Booker, too. Those guys are close, so that helps. And then also, like I said before, it's just going to depend so much on what he looks like this year, right? I mean, there's a chance he just comes out and he's a star. He has that in him. If he has another middling season like the ones he's had, though, maybe he's just less attractive for us, too. So, I don't know. He's a tough one to evaluate at this stage, I think.
He is. He probably sits somewhere between my kind of group 2 and 3, and I'll mention my group 3 now, which is, there's a group there of kind of George Hill, maybe Jeremy Lin, Darren Collison and Corey Joseph, both in Indiana, who, all in either weird situations in terms of the team that they're on maybe not being very good next season, or there not being kind of enough minutes in Joseph and Collison's case to kind of go around on the Pacers. So, I think that group is kind of all guys that, aren't exactly exciting as free agent off-season acquisitions, but we might see the Suns go after just because the point guard play they get this season just really isn't up to scratch, and maybe they even go after them a little bit earlier, Max, and trade for one of them during the season.
George Hill, though, he's tough for me because I think George Hill actually theoretically is an awesome fit with Devin Booker, right? Because he's got that size, he can defend, he's a great shooter. Problem with him is he's old and can't stay healthy, and I'm not sure you're going to try to build your sort of up-and-coming team around a guy who's old and can't stay healthy.
Yeah, I definitely have him in that kind of pack of guys that the Suns might look to trade for this season if everything goes, really poorly, because he's definitely not a long-term guy in terms of building with Booker. But in theory, on paper, he is the type of guy which, they're pretty rare to find that fits really well with Booker as a great off-ball shooter. He's got that history kind of on the old Pacers teams and a great defender. But, we just haven't seen a lot of that in more recent times with him either being on the Kings or not really being able to be healthy on the recent Cavs teams. But, is that something that you would look for? I know that TJ Warren is a contract that would probably be most obvious to get off in a situation like that. Would you bring in Hill for, I guess, essentially half a season, maybe pick up his option, as you alluded to? He's only got $1 million guaranteed for the following season, but would you do almost a straight swap there, Max?
Wait, you're telling me I can get rid of TJ too? Just kidding, everybody. I don't hate him that much. Yeah, probably. I just think he fits the roster a little bit better. We need more shooting, and I think he would provide that. Maybe he gets hurt, but also you get off of him sooner. So one of the things that TJ doesn't make a ton of money, but he does make enough money where he cuts into your cap. If they decide to just part ways with Hill, they'd have a lot more space next summer.
Yeah, and I've kind of got another little group of guys here that I looked around the league for around that TJ salary of $12 million, and I'll call this "How much do you want to get off TJ Warren, Max?" And you've got Daly in Milwaukee, who's got 2 years left at $10 million. Would you do something around a straight swap there?
Yes, just because you're my Australian podcast host, just for you.
Darren Collison, just the 1 year at $10 million. Let's say we have to put a sweetener in there, maybe.
Definitely. I think Darren Collison's actually a pretty underrated player. He shot 45% from three last season.
Jeremy Lin in Atlanta, 1 year at $13 million, the same as TJ, basically.
This one's testing me because I do like to get off TJ's contract, open the space, but I really don't think Jeremy Lin makes any sense for the Suns. So, man, that's tough. I think I ultimately do it.
I think I know the answer to this next one. You've got Schroeder, 3 years at 15.
You found the guy. I would not trade TJ Warren for Dennis Schroeder.
And another interesting one, another Australian connection, at the Spurs. Patty Mills has 3 years left of $12 million instead of TJ's 4 years at $12 million.
That's a fun one.
If things go really bad this season, Max, which is what I'm really alluding to here, is, if the Suns make a panic move, is that one that you'd maybe look at?
I think you'd make worse panic moves than that. Patty Mills is good. That can shoot the ball. He's got, obviously, that veteran experience playing in San Antonio. Yeah, I mean, I don't think they should actively try to do that, but if they're panicking, that's not the worst way to panic.
Yeah, I just think there's, that's a group of guys that kind of earn around TJ's salary. I didn't want to get too complicated with trade scenarios, so just looking at really simple solutions. And it is worst case scenario, but I think it is something that Suns fans need to be aware of.
All right, David, my turn to put you on the spot.
Let's do it.
Putting aside your group one, which, it was Kyrie, Kimba, and somebody else?
Maybe Jeff Teague.
Okay, put aside those guys. You can wave your magic wand and have one of the rest of the point guard class beyond the Phoenix Suns to start next season. Which one is it?
Can I have two, Max?
Sure, why the hell not? Have two.
I'm really interested in Ricky Rubio and what he did under Igor. I think that in terms of defense and playmaking is a really interesting one for the Suns next year. And, as I've already touched on a couple of times this pod, if the Suns, can't get involved in some of those bigger tier free agents, I'd like to see them really hone in on a guy like Patrick Beverley. I think he's similar to Ariza in that he just kind of wants to be wanted. And if you, on July 1st, that was kind of one of the first calls that you made because, maybe you did some pre-work and realized that some of those bigger guys aren't going to, entertain Phoenix, I'd really look at him. And I'd maybe even look at trying to trade for him this season, Max, and getting his bird rights, kind of like the Suns did with Rashawn Holmes.
Yeah, if the Clippers don't have a great season, which if they kind of underachieve, I think that Beverly would be really an awesome trade deadline target.
What do you think it would take, Max? Because he's kind of got a weird $5 million salary, and as you noted, the Clippers are in this weird situation. So, what kind of an asset? Are we talking like the Milwaukee pick? Is that too much?
It's going to come down to the market for him, obviously. None of this is in a vacuum, right? And I could actually see a lot of contenders being interested in trading Patrick Beverley. As we mentioned, he's kind of a perfect fit with a, sort of a ball-dominant primary initiator.
Yep.
So it's going to really depend on what other teams are interested in him. I think the Milwaukee pick is probably the high end of what it would take. Because he's only got that, it would be just trade a rental for half a season. I think there's a chance you can get away with a second-round pick, particularly if the Suns aren't great and just kind of use their own second-round pick.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's about right. But I'd be willing to overpay slightly, as I said, to get those bird rights. And if you were kind of really focused on re-signing him, then the overpayment isn't so bad if and when that happens.
So, David, I think you picked two very reasonable options. I think Rubio and Beverly are stabilizers. They're great vets. They'd be perfect for us. I'm super unreasonable, so for the reasons I sort of mentioned earlier, I think I'd wave my wand and put D'Angelo Russell on the team. Just go for high upside. Let's do it.
Yeah, I think it's, I thought that might be your answer based on your question before. And in terms of going all in and really, trying to bank on a guy that, had a lot higher upside as a younger guy, I think, he's definitely someone to focus on this season to see how he might fit with Booker. And as you noted, he is a Booker friend, and Booker has a lot of power within the Suns franchise now, it seems, and can get things his way. So that'll definitely be something to watch, and wouldn't be the worst case scenario next offseason, I wouldn't have thought.
So, David, let's move on to the draft. As we did with our Power Forward episode, we're going to review both free agency and the draft, but we're kind of sort of by obligation to look at the draft because there ain't a whole lot there, David. There's only a couple of names.
Yeah, there's really no top-end talent in terms of point guard, which is the first thing that I've noticed looking at this class. I'll give another shout-out to the Stepien. They've kind of become my go-to place to catch up on these guys and start my research on the 2019 class. And yeah, you won't see any point guard names at the top of their list or of anyone's list, really. So it's an interesting quandary for the Suns to be in. I don't think they're going to get anything from the draft in terms of a long-term point guard option. And as we noted, when you've got Shaq and Okobo already developing on the roster, maybe the draft isn't the best place to go. But, we would be remiss not to mention a few names here, Max, and see and give the listeners, at least guys to watch next season.
Yeah, we'll do that. Real quick, though, before I list a couple of names, I do want to, you touched on a point there that I think is a really good one, and that's that the Suns want to be good, like, sooner rather than later, right? I think that's the plan.
Yeah.
And drafting a rookie point guard within 2019 draft, probably not the best way to be good right away. But I'll mention a few. So Trey Jones is probably the best prospect. I think he's going to play for Duke this season. He's been overshadowed by the fact that the three best prospects in all of college basketball are on his team.
Yep.
But he's the best point guard prospect, and he's also on that team. So it'll be interesting to see how he runs the show with those guys. And then the other guy is sort of a sleeper, and it's right now he's really not getting a lot of mainstream attention. It's really only the Stepien who you mentioned, and particularly Jackson Hoy, who I love. Everyone should read Jackson Hoy. He's great. His name is Ja Morant. I think that's how you pronounce that. He plays for Murray State. He was a freshman last year. He's got a really nice size wingspan combo, sort of exactly what you're looking for, the whole 6'3", 6'8", whatever, wingspan thing.
Yep.
The way that he was described to me by Jackson and others, it's sort of like if you gave Shai Gilgeous-Alexander more of an athletic burst.
Yep.
Which is obviously extremely tempting if that was a thing. He's still very raw, underdeveloped, but that's somebody who, kind of like Trae Young last year, you could see kind of shoot up boards.
Yeah, I think you've touched on the most important point there, and that's that he's kind of the best Booker partner going forward in this draft class. We touched on a lot with the draft speak before the 2018 draft, looking at who might fit long term next to Devin Booker, and we've spoken about it throughout this entire pod. Is he's probably the one to watch for Suns fans in terms of a long-term fit with Booker. I'll note that the rest of the kind of point guards that are being talked about right now are all kind of 6'2", 6'1", even 6 foot and under. So guys like Bowman, Edwards, and even Hands, who was in last year's draft before pulling out. They're all kind of undersized small guys who just really aren't ideal fits on this Suns team. So not guys that I'll really be looking at unless they have that type of Trae Young season, as you mentioned. But yeah, I'll take the opportunity to give one more shout out to a guy that I spoke about a lot last season's draft coverage, and that is William McDowell White, who's another Aussie, and he does have size. He's 6'5". He also pulled out of the draft and went back to Europe, but he's certainly not going to be a top prospect talked about, I wouldn't have thought. But I have seen a lot of draft people talk about him in kind of the international category, and someone to keep an eye on. And for any of our Australian listeners, he is the son of former AFL player Darryl White. So I'll be keeping a keen eye on him, Max, and I'm still rooting for an Aussie on the Suns team sooner rather than later, hopefully.
Yeah, and the thing about William McDowell White, which I like, and I think this is if the Suns do draft a point guard in next year's draft, I think they're probably going to go a little older. He'll be 21 by the time the next draft happens, and I think rather than go for another Okobo or another younger guy who they have to develop, they'll probably go for maybe like quote unquote the Mikal Bridges of point guards, somebody who's a little older, a little more experienced, who can come in right away and contribute. Yeah,
and we may even see the Suns draft him late and kind of keep him in Europe for even a couple more seasons until he's really ready to come over and and slot in straight away. So yeah, I'm rooting for a guy like McDowell White, particularly with the Aussie connection.
Okay, David, anything left in the draft, or should we move on to 7 seconds or less?
No, I think we've covered point guard from start to finish here, Max. So let's wrap this one up.
Let's do it. So in case you're a first-time listener, 7 seconds or less is a segment that we do every week where one of us asks the other 3 questions for which the other has not prepared and for which the other only has 7 seconds or less to answer, except for we always break that rule. David, I'm asking you questions this week. Are you ready?
Ready.
There was a fun question on Twitter this week. I can't remember who tweeted it out, but I'll give you credit when we post a description of the podcast. But the fun question was, how many games would this Suns team win if prime Steve Nash, were the point guard?
Yeah, that was a fun question and one that I answered on Twitter at the time. And I believe I said 10 extra games. So
okay.
My kind of high side at the moment is 35 for this Suns team. So I would say 45 and a low playoff seed, Max.
I think they actually might be even a little bit better than that because prime Steve Nash just makes everyone else on the team so much better. Like I'd imagine Booker and Ayton would just be much, much better players with him. And so not just the fact that he'd be a super efficient monster point guard, but he just, rising tides, raise all boats kind of thing.
Yeah, and I did see a lot of feedback kind of, alluding to that very thing, Max. So, yeah, I think it would be a positive thing for the Suns for sure.
Okay, question number 2. You can take any point guard all time, excluding Magic Johnson, and put them on the Suns right now in their prime. Which one do you take?
I won't say Steve Nash here because of the last question. I'm going to go a guy that I absolutely love and followed a lot as a little kid before I was a Suns fan, actually, and that is Gary Payton, who's very much Patrick Beverley on steroids, let's say. So I think he'd be the perfect partner next to Booker and the perfect guy for this team.
That's so funny you loved him as a kid because he was quite literally my favorite player as a kid. I had his jersey and I think I cried when the 96 finals ended.
I think we're working out we got more in common than we knew, Max.
Right? Peyton's a great answer, maybe the better answer. My answer was just Steph Curry because Steph Curry is just such a freak. I just put him on the team regardless.
That's true. That's a cheat code.
Okay, let's go to the final question here. If I tell you that one of Knight, Okobo, or Shaq will be in the All-Star game next season, which one will it be? So we'll be clarified. Not 18-19, 19-20.
Ooh, that's a tough one, Max. I'll eliminate Harrison straight away because I just don't think he has the type of game to get there. I'd love to say Okobo here because it would mean that he just starts red hot. But, I'll leave some hope here for Knight to get back to the player he was before he came to Phoenix. And get that All-Star appearance that he was probably robbed of, that he should have got in Milwaukee before he came to the Suns, Max.
It's a fun way to close the podcast. One of Brandon Knight's detractors is now saying he has a chance to make the All-Star game in this season. Okay, everyone. Thanks so much for listening. I think that's it for us. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at MaxMCC11. You can follow David on Twitter at The 4 Point Play. And you can follow our podcast on Twitter at 7SOL Pod. As we mentioned earlier, we really, really appreciate whenever anybody rates and reviews us. It's awesome. It means a lot to us. The feedback is appreciated. David, thank you so much for joining me. This was fun.
Thanks, Max. It was a lot of fun, and we'll be back next episode with another guest.
We will. Until then.
Hey guys, as Max mentioned earlier, we had to edit out a lot of the pod that became irrelevant after the Knight trade. But if you've made it this far without turning off, then I hope you will enjoy the planned Did You Know segment before the big trade went down. A little hidden track for you loyal listeners out there.
All right, David, I think we're ready for Did You Know?
All right, Max, we're down to our last positional pod, and I'm going to argue that from a historical standpoint, we have saved the best till last. Phoenix has had a pretty storied recent history with point guards, despite not getting the best out of the position of late, which I am sure we will get into shortly. Now, you've been on a bit of a roll lately with the Did You Know answers, so I'm going to lob this one up for you and let you finish with a flurry. Did you know there are 37 Suns players who have served between 5 and 13 seasons for the franchise, and 10 of them have played point guard at one point in their careers. Max, let's see how many of those you can name.
So it's point guards who have played between 5 and 13 seasons, is that what you said?
Correct.
Okay, so Steve Nash.
1.
Kevin Johnson.
2.
Jason Kidd.
3.
Eric Bledsoe.
4.
Goran Dragic.
5.
Stephon Marbury didn't get that many, did he?
No.
Okay, so that's what I qualified that one. So I got to go further back. What about is Paul Westphal? That's more of a shooting guard, right?
Yeah, he counts 6.
Okay. Barbosa, you counting him?
He counts 7.
Okay. Starting to drop. Like, can you give me any hints for the last few?
No.
Okay. You know what? I'll settle for 70%. That's not too bad.
That's pretty good. So I think we missed Jeff Hornacek there with 6 years.
Yeah.
Kyle Macy was another one with 5 years. And the only other one that you missed, and it's pretty good effort by you, Max, but the final guy, which I was hoping you were going to miss, is Anthony Hardaway.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize he had that much time.
So, firstly, he was a bit of a combo guard like Barbosa, Hornacek, and Westphal, as you noted. Starting as a point with the Magic, playing a little bit more as a 2 in Phoenix before ending his career as a small forward. Secondly, he also missed practically a whole season with a serious knee injury for the Suns. It was the 2000-2001 season where Penny only managed 4 games before having microfracture surgery on his knee. I'm sure you and the listeners can already see where I might be going with this, but to spell it out, I am of course drawing comparisons to current projected starting point guard Brandon Knight. Knight was traded to the Suns to play alongside Eric Bledsoe before the rise of Devin Booker, which saw Knight relegated to the bench. And of course, we are now seeing the return of Knight after a serious knee injury. But Max, did you know Penny was traded to the Suns to play alongside Jason Kidd in a combo that was labelled Backcourt 2000? A backcourt combo that was pretty lethal when healthy. Injury cut that down in the 2001 season, as I mentioned, before Hardaway returned for 2002 fully healthy again. This time he was joining forces with Marbury, who you also mentioned before, but the Suns recently acquired another 20-year-old young stud who pushed Penny out of the starting lineup. On this occasion, it was Joe Johnson, who relegated Hardaway to the bench for the first time in his career, which of course brings up more comparisons to Brandon Knight. Now, as I mentioned, Max, Hardaway returned after the surgery and put up a solid 12 points, 4.4 rebounds, and 4.1 assists in 80 games played, but with a pretty miserable 41% from the field and 27.7% from 3. Hopefully, for all of our sakes, we can get 80 games out of Knight this season, but with a stat line slightly more impressive. Final bit of Hardaway Knight trivia here for you, Max. We saw the Suns this offseason trade for a pick that they already had previously before trading for Brandon Knight. That, of course, became Mikal Bridges. Perhaps a good omen here because the trade for Hardaway actually included the Suns' own pick that became Amari Stoudemire, which the Suns managed to get back 2 years later before selecting Stat in the draft. Hardaway was then traded out of Phoenix along with Marbury to the Knicks before being traded one more time in his career from the Knicks back to the Orlando Magic. That trade, Max, actually included current Sun Trevor Ariza. So to finish, Max, with Knight entering his 4th season as a Phoenix Sun, he still has a chance to see out his contract in the desert and join the list of point guards with 5 or more seasons service. I guess a lot is going to depend on how this season goes. So before we end the segment, Max, one quick game for you. Penny had career earnings of $120 million in a career spanning 14 seasons. Knight, of course, signed the $70 million extension with the Suns, which takes his total up to $80 million once he's played 8 seasons. How many seasons total will Knight play in the NBA, and will he pass Penny's $120 million?
He definitely won't pass Penny's money if we're counting Little Penny. But I would say he'll play on another contract after this one. He'll never surpass Penny's total earnings.
No, I don't think so. So Thanks for humouring me there. How about we get into it right now and start discussing if the Suns will get adequate point guard play from Knight and a few others this season.
Thanks, David. That was a fun one. I always like the ones where you can find those weird little parallels, like with the Sotomayor thing there.
Yeah, that was a cool one to put together. Thanks, Max.